Hello, everyone, to the December presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I am Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History and will be your host today. First, a few administrative details before today's presentation. As a reminder, all recent, past, and future First Wednesday online lectures are now available on our Friends of History webpage. Just click on the lecture series link at the top of the page. Our monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with support from the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These funds will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our website and click on the Donate button at the top of the page. We are looking forward to our January presentation, when our speaker will be Megan Kate Nelson. On January 5th, Ms. Nelson's presentation will be drawn from her new book, The Three-Cornered War: The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. This book was a 2021 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, and we're happy to have her join us in January. Drawing from extensive historical materials, Ms. Nelson will focus on 9 charismatic individuals who fought for self-determination and control of the region, and whose actions reveal the importance of such individual efforts in the midst of the larger military conflict of the Civil War. Among these individuals are included such well-known figures as John R. Baylor, a Texas legislator who established the Confederate territory of Arizona. U.S. Colonel Edward Canby's wife, Louisa Hawkins, who nursed Confederate soldiers back to health. Kit Carson, who led a regiment of volunteers against the Texans, Navajos, Kiowas, and Comanches. Juanita, a Navy weaver who resisted Union campaigns against her people. And Mangus Colorados, a revered Chiricahua Apache chief who worked to expand Apache territory in Arizona during this period. The presentation will provide a fresh look at events in the New Mexico territory, typically obscured in accounts of the Civil War. If you wish to learn more about this lecture and all upcoming lectures, just join our mailing list via our webpage or email us at the address cited in the chat below. And now for today's lecture. This talk is drawn from the new, revised, and expanded edition of Valles Caldera, A New Vision for New Mexico's National Preserve, by William DeBuys and Don J. Usner, and is published by the Museum of New Mexico Press. DeBuys and Usner will present their personal perspectives on the Valles Caldera National Preserve, highlighting the main events, political and ecological, of the first 20 years of the preserve, and its prospects for the next 20. There will be a photo montage by Don Usner's photographs of the caldera, which he took for both the original 2006 publication and for the new, revised, and expanded edition of the book, published this year. These include a selection documenting the effects of the Las Conchas and Thompson Ridge fires. William DeBuys chaired the Valles Caldera Trust from 2001 to 2005 in its early efforts to manage the 89,000-acre Valles Caldera National Preserve. He is the author of 10 books, including A Great Aridness, Climate Change and the Future of the Southwest, and River of Traps, for which he was a 1991 Pulitzer finalist. His most recent book, The Trail to Kanjiroba, Rediscovering Earth in an Age of Loss, appeared in August of this year. Bill lives on a farm he has tended since 1976 in northern New Mexico. Don J. Usner was born and raised in Los Alamos and Chimayo, New Mexico. He is an award-winning writer and photographer and former official photographer for the Valles Caldera Trust. His books include Orale, Lowrider, Custom Made in New Mexico, Benigna's Chimayo, Cuentos from the Old Plaza, Sabino's Map, Life in Chimayo's Old Plaza, and Chasing Dichos Through Chimayo. Don lives in Santa Fe. Following the presentation, Bill and Don will answer any questions you may have. The questions and comments can be posted at any time in the YouTube chat room, both during and after the presentation. As always, upon completion of today's event, the entire presentation will be posted on the Friends of History webpage, as well as on the History Museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. So, let us now welcome Bill DeBuys and Don Usner.
Well, hello, thanks, Ben. And my name's Bill DeBuys. This guy next to me is Don Usner, and we're old buddies. We've had adventures in many places, from the Arctic to the Grand Canyon and the Pecos Wilderness. But one of the most enduring adventures we've had is our long-term involvement and love affair with the Valles Caldera. And so we're very pleased to be able to present this new and revised edition of our Valles Caldera book, which came out what year, Don?
I believe the first edition was 2004.
That's right, yeah, 2004. And this new revised and expanded edition was supposed to have come out in July of 2020, which would have been the 20th anniversary of the federal acquisition of the Baca location, #1, which became the Valles Caldera National Preserve. But a few things intervened, not least of which was the COVID pandemic. And so at last, now we're happy that this book is out and available. We revised and expanded the original book to cover the immense changes that occurred in the first 2 decades of the existence of the Valles Caldera National Preserve. Of course, one of those big changes was the transfer of the property to the National Park Service, and the history of that transfer is really, I think, a pretty interesting insight into how so much of Washington actually works. So it's a political history that I think will be of interest to a lot of readers. Another big area of change is in the ecology of the Valles Caldera. The biggest trigger to those changes being the massive fire, the Las Conchas fire, and then later a somewhat less powerful fire, the Thompson Ridge fire, which both had big impacts on the ecology and landscape of the caldera. Another thing that we're trying to keep track of in this new book is the increase in our understanding of the Valles Caldera. From way back in the early days of the Valles Caldera Trust, a pretty robust science program was developed. And that program continues under the brilliant leadership of Dr. Bob Parmenter. And it's produced a lot of learning about the Valles Caldera. So some of what we've gained in understanding, only the tip of that iceberg, is presented in the new book as well. Way back when I was involved with the Valles Caldera Trust in the first years, the board we had then, we talked about the products that might come out of the preserve. And I think we agreed in the end that probably the most important product was going to be learning. learning for all kinds of people from preschoolers to postdocs. And I think that concept is actually holding up. To tell you a little bit about what the new book contains, everything is in there that was in the first edition, plus new essays by both Don and me that help to bring the record up to date about what's happened in the caldera, and a whole lot of new photographs by Don, which he'll be talking about in just a couple of minutes. Some of this new work documents the physical and ecological changes brought on by the fires, and all of it presents, all of the photography presents a visual feast of one of the most inspiring and photogenic landscapes in all of North America. And you're seeing that right now as many of these new photographs are coming up on the screen. But the new book, we hope, does more than simply bring the so-called record up to date. We hope that it also shares the special spirit of this very special place. One of the themes of the book is that as we enter the turbulence of ever more powerful impacts from climate change, the Valles Caldera is a superb and probably an ideal place in which to observe and understand those changes, those forces. And there's a very important corollary to that, that the VCNP is also an ideal place for personal reflection and appreciation of the beauty of the natural world. It's a place for all of us, individually and in groups, to come into ourselves and to build the inner strength that we're going to need to contend with the challenges that lie ahead. The challenges that are going to be, in many ways, greater than probably anything we've experienced in the past. We also hope that this book will remind people about how lucky we New Mexicans are to have the VCNP. The first essay that I wrote, the one I wrote for the original edition, tells the story of the really remarkable alignment of political and fiscal planets that made the federal acquisition of the Baca location actually possible. In that year of acquisition, the year 2000, the federal budget actually ran a surplus. It was the first surplus in many years and the last one until the present. People forget that. The country in that moment felt wealthy and capable of buying itself some really fantastically new big presents. The Valles Caldera was one of those. Part of the alignment of planets also was that we had a terrific senatorial team, irrespective of how you feel one way or another about their politics. But Pete Domenici was one of the most powerful Republicans in the Senate, and the Republicans then had a majority, and he could get things done. And Senator Jeff Bingaman had a vision for the Valles Caldera that had its roots many, many years earlier, and he pushed from the Democratic side. We also had the full commitment of the White House. Bill Clinton believed fervently in and personally in the program of getting the Valles Caldera acquired, and he gave an impetus to all the necessary work going on in the executive branch to get this thing done, to get through all the complexities, the red tape, all the rest. And a lot of the responsibility for advancing that work fell on an absolutely superb land acquisition team at the U.S. Forest Service, who brought the project home. So it was an extraordinary collection or lining up of really hard to obtain factors that allowed the Valles Caldera to become part of our federal estate, part of our true nationally protected heritage. The last thing I want to say is that with that incredible good fortune comes a kind of responsibility. We can't afford ever to stop building constituency for the Valles Caldera National Preserve. The only thing that will truly guarantee its protection for the many decades ahead is the commitment of the people who love it to be sure that it is managed properly. And we hope that this book will contribute to the building of that constituency. In addition to everything else it does, maybe that's the most important thing. So that's what I have to say, and I'll turn it over to you, Don. What do you think?
Wow. Well, I second that. That's all. No, very well said. I think that you captured exactly what the book strives to accomplish, and my particular participation is primarily through photography with some writing, and my relationship to the land there is mediated through photography. I find it as a great way to explore and understand my own relationship to the place, and in a bigger sense to ponder the whole idea of the human relationship to this place, which has had a profound impact on people for many generations. Well before Europeans set foot here, it was a revered place that held a very important spot in the cosmology of native people around here and in the practical kind of life ways of the people here. So my personal journey through the place is sort of one of personal reflection on my relationship to this place, mediated through photography. And it's one that started way back when I was a kid. In fact, in starting this project back in 2002, I think was when I first began taking pictures. I discovered a roll of negatives from when I was 7 years old, when I was just first experimenting with my father's camera, and took some grainy black and white images of a snowy winter when we followed the bulldozer up through the caldera and went as far as the bulldozer could go pushing snow. And we stopped at an immense wall of snow and got out and ran around on the top of the fences and across into the caldera. So that in itself is a little story, an indication of how much change has taken place over the span of my experience of the caldera. It's a winter like that hasn't happened for decades, and it's a reflection of the changing climatic regime that's affecting the place. So I started taking pictures way back then, and always had a great desire to get into the caldera. It held a great mystique for me, as it did for everybody who knew the place, everybody who touched on the edge of it, which is all you could do in those days. Driving through, I was actually, the first few times I was through, the road wasn't paved yet, and it was hardly trafficked at all. And you were fortunate if you could drive and take a little walk out into the caldera and sort of nibble around the edges. And that was the extent of the experience of the caldera that the public generally had for many decades, always longing to get in there. And so the first essay I wrote for the book is called Beyond the Fence, and it's about that great desire that I and so many people had to get beyond the fence into this magical landscape that was so compelling and so mysterious and so filled with mythology. We had all kinds of legends about what was back there, gigantic trout and immense elk and lots of things that we imagined that we couldn't really visualize. And we also could not access it through photographs. Remarkably, there had been no real photographic survey of the caldera ever. There were incidental photographs from ranchers and photographers they brought in that mostly focused on ranch activities, but there wasn't really an exploration of the place through photography. So when I had the opportunity to get in there and began taking pictures, I had a strange sense of disorientation. It was as if this place had built up in my imagination for so long, I didn't know how to approach it in reality. I was sort of stunned to get beyond the fence and have some access to look around. And it was kind of overwhelming to know where to begin and how to proceed with trying to produce a photographic record of the place. And it's a journey that I began then in 2002 or 3, and I'm still continuing to explore and try and learn more and understand the place better, constantly going back to that theme of reflecting on my relationship to the place and other people's relationship to this remarkable place. And I am perpetually fascinated with what I'm finding there. Aesthetically and spiritually, there's always a sense of renewal and discovery every time I enter. And so the photographs are not a methodical attempt to document specific features or change in the land, but just by default they do that because I've been visiting for so long and taking so many pictures. So in fact, it's kind of remarkable now to look through the photographs and to see how things have changed, how dramatically they've changed in these 20 years. And that's really what this second edition is about photographically, is presenting a new portfolio of photographs that are more current than were in the first edition. I think I took the last pictures there about 2004. And of course, the most striking thing in terms of the imagery is the effect of the fires. I think for all of us who were in northern New Mexico and longed to get in the caldera and valued it so, it was that image of verdant greenness and rich forests and tall trees, and it was the sense of a well-watered Eden hovering above the valleys. And of course, anybody who goes up in New Mexico is completely fascinated with any trickle of water. And there was plenty of water up there and plenty of greenery. So suddenly much of that was burned and transformed into charred forests that then went through a period of terrific erosion and runoff that tore up the land in dramatic ways, and flooding and a number of consequences of these enormous hot fires that I was unprepared for psychologically or emotionally and shocked by. I think many people were, even though fire ecologists had warned and realized for decades that the catastrophe was in the making. To actually see the results has been quite a shocking experience, as has the whole notion, or having to face the notion of dynamic change in a landscape we're so attached to. Yeah. And that, in the childhood mind, the world is a static place. And especially these refuges like the caldera, which for me has been a deep source of refuge, a deep place of refuge for my whole life, to suddenly see it really torn apart in a dramatic, violent, and extreme way was at first very hard to take. And it's been a process of coming to terms with that change and realizing now as an adult and after seeing this that this is what is happening in the world. It always has been, but it's sort of in a phase of acceleration and quite dramatic change because of climate change and the consequences of that on the landscape. And so coming to terms with the new kind of relationship with this place has been an experience that's somewhat chronicled through the photographs. So one of the ways I did that was all the photographs for the current edition, all the new ones in the photographic portfolio section are all in black and white. And it's just kind of represent, first of all, my own habit now of doing mostly black and white photos and appreciating that aesthetic, but also sort of expressing the remarkable transition in the place over these 20 years and how that's manifested on the landscape many, many acres of burned forest, many, many eroded valleys. And the amazing thing to me is that maybe could have been anticipated, but I've come to appreciate the land for what it is in that altered state. Just as much as I appreciated the verdant forests and the greenery, I understand that what's happening is a dynamic that's a lesson and something to learn from about change and about this landscape and change and about what it lies in the future.
Let me ask you a question, Don. You talked about all the black and white work in the new edition. What do you think black and white photography communicates about the caldera that doesn't get communicated with color?
Well, it's not a real black and white answer. I think a lot of it is sort of a conceit and an aesthetic preference I have, but also it's a more nuanced way to look at the landscape. You eliminate the distraction of color and look at the more basic elements of what you're seeing in the landscape. And it's also a way to make pictures that get people's attention in a new way. Another thing that's happened in those 20 years at the same time that the landscape has changed so dramatically up there is photography has changed completely, almost in that same time frame.
Yeah.
My first digital camera was 2003. In fact, I had digital camera when I started this first project, but I refused to use it because I didn't believe digital was going to go anywhere. It wasn't as good. And so like this picture behind me, that's with the film camera. But now there's a proliferation of millions and billions of photographs every day, most of them in color. And there's a real tendency for people to take the color and pump it up and increase the saturation, the contrast, and make a kind of clownish theatrical representation of the land.
Yeah, I agree. I think in a way, the color can be a trap to emphasize just ordinary beauty. And that by leaving the color out, by going to black and white, we can go to a deeper, less superficial beauty.
I think that's a good way to say it. It kind of stops you. So it's more arresting because we're so accustomed to color.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
makes you look twice.
It makes you look twice and look deeper. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so. And it's a more difficult medium to work with. And people often say, oh, digital photography makes it so easy to manipulate a picture. And it's true. You can sit here at your desk and do the manipulations instead of saturating yourself with chemicals in a dark room. But it's still a very difficult process to extract from this overwhelmingly colorful situation the essence of what you're looking at, what you want to say through black and white imagery. So I find it challenging and really rewarding to practice it.
Got another question for you, and that is that, and eventually we'll go to questions from our friends out there in Zoom land, but you touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to bring you back to it if I could, that you started photographing and trespassing up there when you were pretty small and continued somewhat more aggressively, especially on the trespassing side when you were a teenager and on after that. And then when in 2000, when this became the Valles Caldera National Preserve, I think the trust invited you in to begin taking some photographs so that we would have a stronger and better visual record of the place. And I know, your photographs have hung in the trust offices, and I hope now they're in the offices of the National Park Service that take care of the place. So you've had this long relationship with the place and this long effort to sort of encounter it photographically. And that effort in its formal sense is now more than 20 years long. How do you feel about the place today that's different from how you felt about it back in the year 2001, when you first began to go on to the Valles Caldera National Preserve legally?
Well, I feel less mischievous about it. But it's interesting. I feel like I know the place much better in terms of just the basic layout and dimensions of it. One of the amazing things you discover is, if you start to look around there, the space is much vaster than you imagine even. It's obviously, when you first encounter it, you're impressed by the size of it. But when you start moving around out there on foot, on horseback, on a bicycle, on a truck, all those things I've done, you start to realize that, on paper, 89,000 acres may not sound like much. But when you get out there and start to see the dimensions of it, it's a vast place, made the more so by the expansiveness of the open valles and the distances you can see there. So I have a much better grasp of the physical layout of the place. But, and I have to say, I'm also much more aware of how much the place has been impacted by human activity. One of the pictures I have here is of a stump in the forest, and I realized when I first was photographing, in that picture, I put it in as an example of this, I was really fixated on the idea that this was a pristine landscape that was beyond, had not been touched because I hadn't touched it,
Right.
and the public hadn't. And one day I was looking for a primeval forest picture. Everything was perfect. The sun was coming up. There was fog in the trees. There were beams of golden sunlight. And I could not find a place in this particular forest without stumps.
Yeah.
And I was looking and getting really frustrated and angry and thinking, this is typical. This is typical. And then I suddenly realized, this is the photograph. This is the place. This is what this is, really about.
This is the actuality of the place.
This is the actuality. So I've been encountering the actuality of the place and more and more deeply. And the fires, interestingly, burned off some of that veneer of pristineness, because I go through big burned forests now, and I can see the forests of stumps that were covered with greenery before. So that's been another aspect of my learning.
One of the most surprising factoids that I encountered when the Valles Caldera Trust took over management was that there were, imagine this is a landscape basically 12 miles by 12 miles, something like that. And within that, there were 1,500 miles of logging roads. And so many of them just corkscrewed up Cerro del Medio, but immense networks of roads. So that's part of my encounter with the caldera too, is to understand how powerfully it's been impacted by human activities, but also how powerfully it has been rebounding from those impacts. And I'm delighted to say that the second batch of your photographs, those in the new edition that weren't in the first edition, have a quality I especially love, and there are a lot less fences in it. Removing some of the fences has been a major preoccupation of both the Valles Caldera Trust over the years, and since then, the National Park Service. And removing those fences, the place with so many different ranching regimes over the years, had really been chopped up into little barbed wired spaces. And removing those fences has helped to increase that sense of spaciousness. And one little anecdote I'll tell is that when I was trying to get to know the place, one day I saddled up near the headquarters and just rode straight out into the Valle Grande. And of course, when I started, everything behind me was really big, the trees and the buildings and everything, and the distance was really small. And I rode out a couple of miles across the valle until the ground became too soft for my horse to proceed. We just went as far as we could go into things like that. And when I got as far as we could go, everything in the distance still seemed really small. And when I turned around, everything behind me seemed really small. And the amazing thing was that the stuff in the distance hadn't gotten any bigger. I had been riding for an hour or so, and the distance didn't get bigger. I just got deeper, deeper, deeper into this immense space. It was an absolutely marvelous experience.
Yes, I've had that experience. It reminds me of an anthropologist, Colin Turnbull.
Oh, yeah.
He worked with pygmies.
Yeah.
And he talked about bringing them to see the big, expansive plains, and they had
Of the Serengeti.
Of the Serengeti.
Yeah, he took them to the Serengeti.
And they had no way to comprehend that those weren't little tiny creatures out there.
Yeah, the wildebeest looked about that high to them. Yeah.
So there's a sort of cognitive dissonance that was definitely dominant in my mind for much of my early visits out there, partly because it was unknown and partly because of that sense of space. And I was lost in trying to figure out my way around and how to photograph it. And I'm still finding my way.
Yeah.
But one other thing that I had as a great point of revelation that I talk about in my essay on for the second edition is coming to realize the importance and value of the science going on out there. And part of that, came through conversations with you and our visit to look at where the cores were extracted from the rhyolite rocks to confirm the theory of plate tectonics.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realized my relationship with the place and the relationship with Native people and the relationship with other people who've come throughout the centuries is continually changing. And a really important piece of that now is that program going out there to look at it through the lens of scientific inquiry.
Yeah.
And that was a big revelation for me, that's just equally as important and valid as the spiritual quest that I sort of see myself on, and that I tell the story about meeting a Native woman.
I wanted to underline that story because I think that's a really remarkable thing in your new essay. It was completely unanticipated. You were out there in really severe winter conditions, and far from the road, you encountered this Native woman in pretty ordinary, just track shoes, tennis shoes, out there in deep snow, bitter conditions on a personal pilgrimage. And that really underscores the depth of the significance of this place to so many people from tribes of many different origins over literally thousands of years. And so this has been a truly resonant place for human beings for really as long as there have been human beings in this part of the world. Anna Stephan, our archaeologist friend, has taught me a lot about the Archaic period. And the Valles Caldera is one of the finest places anywhere for understanding the Archaic period. And the obsidian there at the Valles Caldera has attracted people from hundreds of miles away for literally thousands of years. So this is as resonant a place as ecologically, historically, anthropologically as we'll ever, and spiritually as we might ever hope to encounter anywhere.
Yes, and all those ways of seeing the place are still present.
Yeah.
And that's what amazed me, is her trekking out there with the eagle feather. As a young woman facing a personal life crisis, her instincts were to go there.
Yeah.
To walk to the river with an eagle feather. So that to me encapsulated everything you just said about the importance of that landscape and the power it has. It's so compelling on that level for so many people.
So I think we can't top that one. So maybe this is a good time to invite questions from our Zoom friends out there.
That sounds like a plan.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's go for it.